According to a recent Gallup study from last year, the American third-party system is more demanded now than at any point in really American history. For whatever reason, the American public believes that a third party is necessary, and they've largely lost faith in the two-party system that we currently have and have basically had since the Civil War. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am the lead professor of political science and the director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy here at Campbellsville University, and welcome you all to our broadcast today with our senior seminar crew, where we're going to be talking about the American third parties, the two-party system, and then covering a range of topics from why we only have two parties to whether or not a third party would even be viable in the United States. Joining me today for our discussion are three of my seasoned veteran panelists here for Senior Seminar. From top to bottom, as they appear on my screen, we have Bethany Davis, who recently just won Top Speaker Award at the local CPFL Open Debate Novice Division. Ms. Davis, good morning.
Good morning.
We also have joining her partner, who with her won the top team at same said debate, Luke Glasscock. Mr. Glasscock, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you.
And finally, we have Kylie Crowley, who is not on the debate team because she is too busy being an intern and working for the state of Kentucky and getting ready to go to law school. Ms. Crowley, how are you?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
Doing just fantastic. So let's get into this. The United States, we have a two-party system, and we are one of the few countries in the world that only has two political parties. Almost all other democracies have at least one viable third political party that kind of messes up things. Most democracies have 4 or 5 major political parties, or they'll experience lots of change in the party system. So I guess before we get into a discussion about what our third parties have done for us, let's really, why do we only have two political parties? So what are the origins of the two-party system in the United States today? Let's start there. And how have these parties typically aligned themselves? Ms. Davis, if you want to go ahead and start off with that.
Yeah, so in 1796, when people first began to really run for elected positions, the Federalist Party that was in favor of the Constitution was kind of going against the Democratic Republicans, which were more concerned with kind of extending the revolution to more ordinary people like farmers and workers in the United States. One really interesting thing about that is that George Washington clearly denied or discouraged the idea of a two-party system, which I think is really interesting because that's what we have today, and the third party rarely gets any traction during the election. So from the beginning, both parties were kind of divided, not as polarized as they are today, but they were divided and did think that the other one didn't have the best intentions and that their own party was the right one. Later on in 1854, the Republican Party emerged as an anti-slavery party and was up against the more conservative-minded Democratic Party. And then eventually, after that, a big part of the working class people, mainly made up of white people, started to form the Republican Party, while the Democratic Party was made up of more African Americans, Latinos, and progressive white people. Today, I think we kind of still follow that divide where conservative party is, or the Republican Party is seen as more conservative, the Democratic Party is seen as more liberal. And like I said today, they're way more increasingly polarized than they even were at the beginning.
Going off what Bethany said, I would say that there's definitely things that have amplified our polarization today, but I don't think that you can deny that the election of 1796 was really polarized. There were times when they would almost despise the other party, much like some people do today. I would compare the election of 1796 to a lower volumed election of 2020.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you made. Back in the election of 1800 too, they were calling one of the candidates, Thomas Jefferson, everything but an atheist. And some newspapers actually went so far as to say that he was a devil worshiper, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a very astute point. Okay, so we got this history, I guess, of two parties forming and kind of weaving back and forth with these two political parties. Why was the Republican Party the last time that we had a serious challenger to the two-party system? Why do we only have two political parties? Why don't we have a third or a fourth one? Kylie.
Well, the best explanation to that is the Duverger law. Let me pronounce that correctly. It's a concept created by a French political science, and it basically states that third parties are not competitive with other parties because there's no prize for winning. Third parties can run and they can kind of affect how the vote goes, or maybe not affect how the vote goes. I'm trying to say affect like policy making and like encourage like attention to like new ideas. However, there's no really percentage for or prize for winning because you don't win a percentage of the vote that would even make a difference. Like your prize for winning is basically to rally the support of a minority percentage, which Duverger basically said there's no point in winning. There's no legitimate race there because you know that you have no chance of winning against a two-party that's already, or a two-party system that's been established for a long time. So.
Can I add to this? And so with Duverger in the United States, it's actually very solidified, especially in our legislative elections, because there's single-member district plurality. And so if whoever gets the most votes is who wins. And so in reality, all like third parties generally are a break off, like one from left to right further in a direction. And so all it's actually going to do would be to take votes away from the party that they would actually most agree with. And so that's part of it. And also in the United States, since we have an electoral college to elect our president, that further solidifies a two-party system.
I think that in Topics and Democratization last spring, I want to say that we had a discussion about how third parties can actually enter the election to like kind of take away votes from other parties. So you'd end up getting a less qualified, less suitable candidate because people that are like extremists might disagree with the candidate that's out there right now, but it's not necessarily that they don't agree with their ideas. It's they don't agree to the extent of their ideas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but both of you alluded to something like that the effect of third parties has less to do with their own success and more to do with how they steal votes away or cause problems for other parties. Ms. Davis, do you basically agree with that assessment? Do you think that the experiment with so-called third parties has more to do with weakening other parties?
I would agree with that. I think that people who run for third parties have seen that they don't have a chance of really winning the election, but it's more of a way to influence the political system, influence the election. And I think that whether they're trying to take away votes from the other party, it might not work that way. They might be taking votes away from their own party. It might not be as successful as they would want it to be.
Is that why you guys think that we keep coming back to this third party experiment? Like what is the logic here? You made a pretty good case that for a third party to have a chance of success is relatively limited, and that voting for a third party over a long period of time doesn't make much sense. But we keep having these things. Why do we have third parties popping up over and over again in American history?
When I was researching, there seem to be two ways that third parties influence the political system, direct and indirect ways. So the direct impact for the parties is that they provide an outlet for disaffected voters by offering additional choices in the voting booth. And that's a quote by Sage Publishing. So basically, they provide an extra option for people who are unsatisfied with the two candidates that the majority parties have provided. And then the indirect impact is that the potential loss of votes to a third party can instigate change within one or both of the major parties. So this being said, the third party can kind of hold the two major parties accountable, pushing them to adapt and evolve, which one might argue is vital to a vibrant party system. So if either party is losing votes to a third party, it will help hold them accountable and work towards creating a party that more people want to actually vote for. Third parties see increasingly more support when the two candidates for the majority parties are seen as unfavorable to the majority of the public.
Yeah, going off of what Bethany just said, I do feel like there are indirect and direct ways that third parties affect the American political system, and why that we keep having two parties. One of the biggest things is third parties, like I said, have no legitimate chance. And I hate to say that, but third parties, there are benefits that they bring. I think Bethany said, like, basically the same argument I made in my paper. They increase action and new thinking, and they provide voters with additional options. I think one of the biggest things with elections, at least recently, I want to say maybe the past 2 elections, has been just getting people to vote. And I think that you could probably survey or research somehow the effect of third parties on even getting people to, like, voter turnout, really.
I would say that third parties do, even though they don't actually have a viable chance, sometimes like the major parties will begin to encapsulate. So it kind of has a sort of accountability measure. They might start taking in those third parties just to strengthen their base. Like, okay, this is what you guys want. We mainly agree, and you guys, because third parties are generally sort of like policy based, like things that they really believe in. And so, they might start like trying to get their support. And so there is a certain accountability that comes with third parties. And
So I guess while we're talking about that, Luke, what are some examples of that? So you mentioned that third parties might be absorbed into the party from which they came. Can you think of any examples of major third parties in the last couple of 100 years, 150 years, that showed up, impacted politics, and then maybe got reabsorbed?
There are some third parties that have come up, and that presidents even run, or try, not presidents, but presidential candidates ran under. There's been like the Progressive Party. There have been the Dixiecrat Party, and there was a candidate from the South who ran, and he ran as a Democrat or an independent, and he was actually a Dixiecrat technically, though. And so these have been, changed into the third parties. I would say the Republican Party in the last 60 years has absorbed a lot of the Southern vote, which was always Democrat until very recently. And so that's like a major example of a sort of fringe third party that was sort of ousted from the Democrat Party, and the Republican Party. I guess it's not necessarily fortunate always, but they definitely got that base of voters.
Also, historically, one of the most significant third parties, or arguably probably the most significant third party, was the Populist Party. The Populist Party influenced labor reform and like women getting out of like domesticated roles, not so much women's suffrage, but really like women really getting involved in the workforce. And that was during the Gilded Age, which obviously has been years and years ago, but it was one of the most significant third party runs. And the Populist Party, it didn't I think it kind of like just it was absorbed by one of the other parties. It didn't have like a legitimate race, but that encouraged like different thinking, and candidates were like, well, a lot of people this is getting a lot of traction. A lot of people are paying attention to this party. So maybe they're onto something there. And I think it made the candidates in the next election more likely to consider different paths of running, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Why do you think that some of those third parties have been more successful than others? So you mentioned the Populist or the Dixiecrats. Some of our viewers who are a little bit older might remember the United We Stand America Party of Ross Perot. Why do you think that these candidates these parties are able to rise up in the first place, even if they don't have any staying power? Do you guys have any ideas?
So use a perfect example of Ross Perot. And I would say money was a major factor in his campaign. I don't exactly know like the other parties, like why they come and go and like actually have power. But he's like the perfect example that he spent a ton of money, and it was actually a lot of personal money, and to get to where he actually came on the national stage and received a lot of votes in a presidential election. And I would say money was a major factor in that case.
Kylie, you wanted to add something?
I think that was me, unless Kylie.
It was money, but I agree with what Luke said. It's really money when it comes down to it.
I just wanted to bring up the idea of like unfavorable candidates in the two main parties again. During my research, I was researching the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and I found that 7.8 million people voted for someone that was not either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. The Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, actually gained 4.5 million votes, and the Green Party representative got 1.5 million. So although this wasn't exactly enough to swing the election, I think it took away votes from the two majority parties, and then therefore made that election between the Republican Democrat candidates super, super close.
Have there been instances where the presence of a third party was able to change the outcome of the broader election, where maybe we get a different president than we otherwise would have had it not been for the existence of the third party? Are you all aware of any?
I could argue that the 2016 election is an example of this, just because it was so close, and Donald Trump did win without having the popular vote. There was a 48% research by Pew Research, 48% people surveyed said that they voted for Hillary Clinton, while 45 people said that they voted for Donald Trump. So even though more people said that they did vote for Hillary Clinton, he did win, even without the majority election. I think that had a lot to do with the third party voting, since a good amount of people, millions of people, did vote outside of the two major parties because they were unhappy with either candidate that was presented.
So there have been several examples. I mentioned the George Wallace. He ran and he actually took votes away from another Democrat candidate, and I believe I think it was the election that Richard Nixon won the election. And also back to Ross Perot, he ran, and his platform wasn't anything like. It was something more similar to a Republican platform. And so he actually took votes away from George H. Bush in the 1992 election, and it led to Bill Clinton winning that election.
One of my favorite things to do, I have friends of mine who are on the left wing of the Democratic Party, and every time we get together, I remind them of the experiment with Ralph Nader, because whereas Ross Perot arguably may have cost H.W. Bush the election, and there's some debate about that. His son almost certainly won Florida because of the Green Party and Ralph Nader, and a margin of victory of less than 700 votes. And so yeah, I guess I probably have at least a couple. I hadn't thought about that one recently. So that's the presidential election. Any sense about an impact on legislative elections? Has there been any points in recent history where having third parties in the legislature has changed how the legislature's behaved?
I would argue the Populist Party again, because legislators make laws, and the Populist Party led to a lot of action because of affecting the primary two parties when it gained a lot of traction. But as far as knowing an exact time that it affects the legislator, I'm unaware of one. I just thought that the Populist Party, because it did affect so many policy making and decisions and kind of pushed them towards a more progressive route during that time, that it would affect the legislator.
I mean, I know certainly that Bernie Sanders doesn't technically align himself with the Democratic Party, but I can't imagine a scenario where Bernie Sanders would abandon the Democratic Party, maybe except for gun control. But even then, I can't imagine a scenario where Bernie Sanders would abandon the Democratic Party coalition just because he's not a Democrat and help the Republicans. Is that something that you think is a viable thing?
I would say, yeah. I think that you could, I wouldn't say that all third parties are in the middle by any means. That's not what I'm trying to express, but I do feel like you can lean either way. But because of the political polarity that there is today, there's parties that are getting to be where they're more extreme and like farther and farther apart. And I think that third parties are more warranted today because they are so far apart. People want something that either falls in the middle or falls a little bit one way and a little bit the other way, something like that. They don't want something that's so extreme, which a lot of politicians are becoming more and more and more distanced. So.
Do you think then, so going back to the slide that we showed at the beginning, or the website that we showed at the beginning, this idea this observation that an increasing number of Americans want something like a third party, it probably comes from that argument that you just made, Kylie, that as the parties have become more polarized, more and more people in the middle kind of wish that there was a third party. Do you think that the time is ripe for another third party revolution? Do you think that there's a chance that in the next presidential election or soon thereafter, we could have a serious attempt at third parties? Or do you feel like America has basically learned its lesson and there won't be another major third party attempt?
I would argue that I wouldn't say that there wouldn't be more major third party attempts. I think that there will be, and I think that there will always be, but I also would argue that they're never going to be as legitimate as we want them to be, or at least probably in our lifetimes. And I also had a quote from DeSilver in 2022. The two primary parties are further apart ideologically than they ever have been at any time during the past 50 years. And that's one of the reasons that third parties are more warranted today. So I would argue that the current political system is ripe for a third party candidate. I just don't feel that it will be a legitimate run.
Going off what Kylie says, I think that's a good point, because as the two parties become increasingly polarized, I think that people might be looking for somewhere else to land, whether that's they're so polarized that they want an extreme party on either side, or they're looking for something that's more in the middle. I think that people are looking for something that might not fit in the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate as it is. However, I think people are so used to the two-party system that I don't think that it could become as legitimate. I don't think a third party could gain as much traction and become as legitimate as it would need to be in order to actually win an election or have a really good chance at it.
So going back to what we were talking about earlier about Duverger. So in the United States, like it won't actually ever be viable, because it would have to literally be like a takeover of one of the parties, like knock a party off of its pedestal. And as many, even though like there is lots of, people hold issue with, how extreme they've gotten, the parties still are, there's a big middle base in the party that isn't extreme one way or the other. We do happen to see a lot of a radicalness in each of the parties. But that's the good thing about having a two-party system. It does offer stability overall. And Federalist 10, they talk about that, so this two-party system can actually keep the people that are on the outside of the parties, on extremists, sort of in check, because, even though we see more of it, it does have to align a little bit with the party, and it doesn't allow for them to make their own party, them to become a part of our government. And even though both parties do have sort of radicals in our government, they're not allowed to actually be the like decision makers that affect all the legislation and whatnot.
What do you think would happen, hypothetically, if a third party attempt was waged to try to wedge in between the Republicans and Democrats in the next presidential election? Which of the two political parties do you think would be hurt the most? Which do you think would benefit the most if a moderate third party was created?
I would argue that the Democratic Party might be hurt the most if a third party really had a chance in the election, just because a lot of people are unsatisfied with the way the Republican Party has been leaning. And so I think if a candidate for the Republican Party was able to kind of deny that third party and see as how like they can take the Conservative Party back to something that more conservatives might appreciate, then that might hurt the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is, although leaning more left, it's remaining more consistent in its support than the Republican Party. So I think a third party might harm the Democratic Party more in that way.
And so you're thinking sort of like a long-term 2 or 3 elections from now, if the third party got the Republican Party's ship in order, then the Republican Party would be able to dominate. Is that?
I think that definitely could be true. Yes.
I agree. I would argue that the Democratic Party would probably be most affected by a third party legitimate run. And that's because there are, I would say, many people, but there are many people that kind of want to be a Democrat but don't like Joe Biden. And with Joe Biden being in power right now, I think that that's not necessarily harming the American people and the American political system, but that it's definitely affecting the Democratic Party as a whole, because there are a lot of like media out there that goes against Joe Biden, and that's getting more and more traction. I've seen with the years that he's been in office now. So
I originally would have thought maybe the opposite, but now that I've listened to the other panelists say that it would actually hurt the Democrat Party, I probably agree with that. I think if there was sort of a middle party that, went back to focusing on less like moral issues, that you would actually, more economic issues, more just things that actually what the parties used to be focused on instead of what it's actually become, that you could actually probably swing a lot of Democrats more into the middle. And so, it probably would actually hurt the Democrat Party overall.
It's interesting. There's an editorial piece co-authored by Phil Gramm. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal this morning or yesterday. That made something like a similar argument. His argument is basically that Hispanic voters are shifting to become more economically motivated, and that while they've been historically attached to the Democratic Party, as they become more economically minded and more middle class and upper middle class, that'd be right to be plucked out of the Democratic Party coalition. Maybe a third party would be able to successfully do that. But do you think that a third party challenger would arise out of the Democratic Party? I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about Joe Biden. Whenever I think about like the Liz Cheneys of the world, would there be a possibility that someone like Liz Cheney might try to challenge Donald Trump if he ran for re-election in 2024? The reason why I mention that is I think about when Teddy Roosevelt, as the former president of the United States, created his own political party, the Bull Moose Party, for the sole purpose of undermining the Republican Party. I wonder if a Liz Cheney would do something like that. Interesting questions. A lot to think about. So on balance, now that you guys have spent a couple of weeks with this topic, do you think that third parties as a whole, or third party movements as a whole, have they had a positive benefit on the American political system? Do you think that we're better off because they've been here? Or do you think that the impact that they've had on elections and changing election outcomes has actually had a more negative impact on American politics? What do you guys think?
Although I do think that there are benefits to it, I would argue that it has had more of a negative impact, especially with candidates especially written-in candidates or candidates that people don't really see as legitimate, like Kanye West or things like that. I think that these third parties or independent candidates can be harmful because they're taking away votes from the two major parties and therefore making the elections increasingly close and more polarized. That being said, I do think there is a benefit to having these third parties, like as the founding fathers did say that the two-party system was not going to be beneficial. I agree with that. I just am not sure how, if a third party actually had a legitimate chance, how that would affect, but I do think it's had more of a negative impact than a positive.
I can understand where Bethany's coming from. I would argue that the third-party systems historically have been of benefit to the American political system, but now I would argue that they have a negative impact. It definitely has changed over time. There's been a lot that's evolved. In the beginning, I think the very beginning, like 1796, the biggest thing against it was that it was a threat to the republic. Now I believe that it's a threat to parties that have a legitimate chance. And historically, it did encourage newer thinking and different policy making and attention to issues that mattered. But now I think that third party candidates pose more of a negative impact due to their kind of swaying votes in ways that really aren't what the American people would want.
I would say that third parties, and I was actually originally going to do my research on this, but I will say a positive outcome from having third parties, because people do they can be motivated by a third party like political platforms or whatever. And so they may actually get out and vote more. There's evidence to show that, it does increase voter turnout. And so that is, a positive thing. However, then again, you have someone who goes and votes only for a candidate that's running for whatever, and then they have to go down the rest of their ballot, voting Democrat or Republican for different offices. And so, I guess it increases their third party candidates never win. But so perhaps it does have a benefit to the other candidates who will get more votes one way or the other, for different offices that are other two major parties. And again, in the United States, obviously our government doesn't work the way it does in other countries that, third parties are actually viable. So we don't have the issue of coalition governments, overturning a majority government and whatnot. But, there is evidence in other countries that third parties can cause instability in government. And we obviously don't have that issue as much, and we never will because of how because of how our government is structured. But just around the world, I would say third parties can be problematic.
Could you imagine with the three of you individually, could you imagine a scenario where you would be persuaded to vote for a third political party? Or having done the research now, do you feel like supporting the two major political parties is in our best interest?
I would say not right now, but if you ask me again in 25, 30 years, maybe. But yeah, like I don't think that a legitimate third party run is out of the picture, which I know goes against what I've said, but I guess I've kind of like turned around a little bit with this discussion. But I don't think that a third party couldn't make a legitimate run, but I feel like right now and probably within the next soon to be years, probably the next 20 years, maybe is pushing it. I don't see a third party making a legitimate run. I think that a third party needs to gain so much traction before they even really have a chance. So I don't know that you could convince me right now to vote for a third party, but maybe in the future.
I would say at a state level, I would perhaps vote for a third party. Like I know in Texas, the Libertarian Party is actually somewhat, doing okay, I guess. I mean, they don't have like a ton of elected officials that are libertarian, but it is viable on a state level. But for a national level election, or especially the presidency, I mean, it would just literally be a waste of a vote. So you might as well vote for someone who you at least agree with. And also on gubernatorial campaigns, I would perhaps, in Oregon right now, they have a Democrat, Independent, and Republican, and a Republican is probably going to win for the first time in many decades because they do have a third party candidate. And so, obviously that again poses issues of taking votes because it's a predominantly Democratic state. But, perhaps the independent candidate could win and it would be somewhere kind of in the middle that people could agree with. So I could see a benefit, especially on the state level, of voting for a third party.
I'd agree with both Kylie and Luke on that I don't think at this point I would be persuaded to vote for a third party. But I think that if it was ever able to gain traction and be legitimate and have a chance, then I could definitely be persuaded to vote for a third party. But at this moment, I would feel more confident in voting for one of the two major parties that my vote would kind of count for more.
Well, I'm curious to see whether or not your perceptions, which seem to be pretty consistent, will be the perceptions shared by the average American as we move through the next couple of elections. I want to extend a thank you to my panelists for joining me here today this morning. I also want to thank you guys at home who either watched live or who maybe caught this on YouTube or on Facebook. Streaming a little bit later. I also want to remind you that this is part of our fall semester weekly series, and we will be having another broadcast the same time next week at 8:30 in the morning. This time we're going to be looking at changes to the United Nations Security Council and whether, particularly in light of the conflict in Ukraine, if maybe the United States should consider pushing, or maybe the rest of the world should consider advocating for a change to the structure and the makeup of the UN Security Council. So join me again next time. And until we see you again, thank you.